Thank you very much, Jo, for the introduction, and thank you to Ben for joining me this evening to talk about your book. I'm really glad to have you here. So we're going to talk today about your book on extinction. So the book is on extinction, yet you approach the topic of extinction in a unique way in this book, employing a rich mixture of philosophical, psychoanalytical, and political critique. So could you perhaps start by telling us about your approach and what your aims were when writing the book in this particular way?
Yeah, thanks very much, Kate, and thanks for inviting me to do this lecture discussion today. Maybe the first thing to say is that this kind of bringing together of philosophy, psychoanalysis, and political critique is not necessarily something new to this latest book. It's been a feature of most of my writing to date. Even when I thought I was writing conventional academic books, these weren't always, shall we say, respectful of conventional disciplinary boundaries. And so this kind of transdisciplinary or indeed anti-disciplinary approach has been, I think, about trying not just to pose new philosophical and theoretical questions, but primarily about finding new ways of arriving back at the political present. And I think that's something that we'll hopefully kind of go on to discuss, later on. But as to the book itself, the first thing to say, perhaps, is that it's not a conventional book about extinction, in the sense that its primary focus is not climate change, species loss, or indeed the so-called sixth mass extinction. These things are all there for sure, but they're folded back into a much bigger philosophical, psychoanalytic, and political narrative. And I would say that, very simply put, the book does two key things. First, it provides a kind of new philosophical history of extinction has continued to fascinate and to provoke thinkers all the way from Kant and Hegel through to figures like Adorno and Freud in the 20th century. And indeed, one of the implicit claims of the book, in a way, is that the whole history of modern European philosophy can, in one sense, be reread as a history of thinking about extinction or the end of the world. The other thing that the book does is, I think, to think in a different way about the whole relationship between time and catastrophe. So nowadays, for example, we hear lots about, tipping points and climate deadlines and doomsday clocks and all the rest. But I argue that catastrophe is not, in fact, some existential dark cloud that's still looming on our horizon. It has, in one respect at least, already started. It's already arrived. And it's already having a clear impact on our economic, social, and political life. And so then in this context, the question then becomes, okay, how do we think and how do we act when it's already too late? Mm-hmm. And I mean, sorry.
Please go ahead.
No, I was just going to add, it just kind of came to mind now that I think that, there's something interesting about the way in which catastrophe often appears precisely in the guise of something that is still to come. I think this is really nicely dramatized in something like, Henry James's short story, The Beast in the Jungle, where the character John Marcher spends decades literally waiting for the arrival of what he calls the beast, the singular event that will change everything in his life, failing to see that the beast is precisely what keeps arriving while he preoccupies himself with his own waiting. So there is this kind of strange tendency, I think, and a strange kind of temporal logic that goes with it, where we can find ourselves anxiously awaiting something that has in fact already arrived.
Thank you. I mean, you mentioned that this novel approach, this transdisciplinary or anti-disciplinary approach has been present in all of your work, you say. I mean, how does this book fit within your wider work, both your previous publications and your current work in progress? I mean, I believe that On Extinction is conceived as the first book in a series. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I guess on the surface there might appear to be a kind of big step change between some of the books. So, you know, a book on Wittgenstein's Tractatus, followed by a collection of philosophical and aesthetic essays entitled Living Wrong Life Rightly. And then we move to this latest work on extinction. But I think in a way, all the books are working in some respect towards the same end. So showing how we might, you know, continue to do things with modernism, how the distorting lens of psychoanalysis might continue to help us to unlock the social in new ways, and how philosophy might continue to be used, in Althusser's phrase, as a kind of revolutionary weapon. I think beyond this, all the books are attempting in different ways to keep alive what we might call a number of old-fashioned ideas, not least the unconscious, the dialectic, and the death drive. Ideas dismissed today, I think, as so many relics of a kind of outmoded style of theorizing, a style of theorizing that is often perceived as out to steal one's enjoyment of the text precisely by rendering it always political. And yes, you're absolutely right. On Extinction is intended as the first work in a trilogy. The second one I'm currently working on is a work on violence, where violence is conceived in the broadest possible sense. So aesthetic violence, linguistic violence, violence against nature, and of course the ugly jouissance of war. The work actually begins with a boldness or indifference that Adorno makes significant use of in his later work, specifically Negative Dialectics and some of the later essays. And its specific starting point is actually a reading of John Ford's great Western film, The Searchers. And I have some new material out about that shortly, so I'll maybe not say any more. And then the third book in the series will be a book on nature, which is in fact where the book on extinction actually started. And it will be about the relationship between what I call first, second, and third nature, about questions of habit, about madness, and much else besides. So the Extinction book, in a sense, set off a number of connected lines of thought, connected lines of inquiry, which it now seems fruitful for me to pursue. And of course, as somebody interested in dialectical criticism, I very much like the rule of threes. So that's the trilogy. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, the question of violence is something that I would like to come back to, I think, later in the conversation. But for now, I wonder if we could talk about some of the key contemporary debates that the book addresses. So you talk specifically about anti-natalism, for example, and de-extinction, right? The attempt to use new technologies to revive extinct species. You're very critical of both of these things, describing them as a kind of disavowal rooted in a form of species shame. I mean, can you explain a bit more about that? Why you think they're both such a failed response to our time of crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just to begin by clarifying what antinatalism is, assuming that there might be some listeners that aren't fully aware. So antinatalism is the view that human beings should cease procreating and bring about their own extinction. Why, one might ask? Well, simply put, according to the anti-natalist, in any human life, the quantity of pain will always outweigh the quantity of pleasure. And therefore, according to this kind of simple utilitarian calculus, no human life is ever worth the harm of coming into existence in the first place. The ecological variant of this anti-natalist position says that humans should kill themselves, or at the very least refrain from reproducing themselves for the sake of nature. What's wrong then with this position, and specifically the latter ecological variant of this position? And I'd say, there are many things, but maybe I'll just highlight two here, which specifically concern the politics of sacrifice, which I think is kind of problematic in this particular concept. So first, while anti-natalism sounds extremely pessimistic, and that there is, of course, a clear sense in which the anti-natalists are enjoying their pessimism, one might say. Mm-hmm. I think ultimately it's naively optimistic, in the sense that it still labors under the illusion that human beings can act in order to save nature by sacrificing themselves, failing to see that nature is, in a sense, in fact, completely kind of indifferent. But the key problem here, I think, is that, anti-natalism turns out to be something that is kind of radically kind of depoliticizing. So, precisely by its very refusal to name the enemy, and its refusal to kind of see any different form of life for human beings that might potentially emerge, it therefore plays into the hands of those very forces that are in fact destroying nature. The second criticism that I have of anti-natalism actually begins from a section in Adorno's late lectures on metaphysics, with a section entitled Dying Today. And there Adorno kind of says that just as life under capitalism can't be lived rightly, so it can't be ended rightly either. So the kind of old idea of death as the grand kind of culmination of a life fully lived is now, completely obsolete in a sense. And with this in mind, I argue that anti-natalism is not merely kind of concerned with sin, but rather with pursuing what we might call a kind of heroic death, or a right death in a wrong world, to paraphrase Adorno. But this fantasy turns out, I think, to be narcissistic through and through, and almost a kind of secular version of modern day sainthood, where we get kind of one group of people who can die this kind of sublime and heroic death, while the rest of us have to content ourselves with the mere struggle for survival itself. De-extinction, on the other hand, of the anti-natalist position. So the de-extinctionist believes that he or she can solve all of nature's woes, but this time through advanced science, specifically through the resurrection of extinct species, such as the woolly mammoth or the Tasmanian tiger. So we have this kind of obscene proposal that capitalism, as the force that is moving inexorably in the direction of extinction, is at the same time the force that is going to step in and save everything in this truly kind of spectacular way. And as I put it, I think at one point in the book, de-extinction is an attempt to create wonder and awe on the back of global planetary wreckage. So maybe I just to add, I mean, the extinction always kind of struck me a little bit like the like a kind of biotech version of the Forkdar game that we find in Freud. And so just as the child kind of throwing the cotton reel kind of into his cot and pulling it out again is an attempt to deal with the anxiety provoked by the mother's absence. So the de-extinctionist kind of scientist in bringing back certain species is also kind of caught up in this drive towards mastery. But his game, I think, is far less courageous and inventive than the one played by the child, in the sense that it's really just about profit making and the dominance over nature.
Mm. I mean, I think the other thing you say in the book as well is that really that it makes little sense when the conditions responsible for the species extinction in the first place persist or indeed have got worse, then the whole project of de-extinction doesn't really make sense at all, does it?
No,
Because it's not addressing those underlying conditions.
no. Absolutely, yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, it pays no regard whatsoever to addressing any of the underlying causes in the same way as the anti-native disavow completely the fundamental causes of the ecological extinction crisis. And we're left with this choice of either kind of radical self-sacrifice or technological kind of acceleration. And yeah, I think both are, as you said in your question, failed or false responses to the catastrophe. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, you're also very critical of the nature of modern eco-activism, and you write in the book specifically about the activities of Extinction Rebellion. I mean, what is it that you find ineffective about their strategies? What do you think it is that they ought to be doing differently?
Yeah, I mean, just to say that this is, the critique of XR that emerges in the book is not, cheap political kind of point scoring in any way. The issue is fundamentally one of tactics, and certainly tactics on the left. And I think, in the same way that it's necessary to have a critique about what went wrong with Occupy, for example, or what went wrong with the campaigns of Corbyn and Sanders, I think it's also necessary to have a kind of a critique of certain elements of contemporary eco-activism, especially at a time when increasingly people are talking about exhaustion and burnout, and there are big questions about where the left actually moves in this new kind of period of converging catastrophes. So I didn't really XR in the book until I stumbled back across a short story by Kafka, of all people, and the short story is called "Give It Up," and it's one of Kafka's kind of micro stories, which is only kind of one paragraph long. And in the story, an unnamed narrator, or an unnamed character, should I say, finds themselves lost in a strange town, and not knowing kind of where to go or who to turn to, they run breathlessly to a policeman and ask the policeman the way. And the policeman responds by saying, "You're asking me the way? I suggest you give it up. Give it up." And he turns away laughing. So very simply then, that as I take it, the story is dealing with someone making the wrong appeals to the wrong person at the wrong time. And the person to whom these appeals are actually being made, which is to say a person in authority whose job it actually is to defend the status quo, actually finds all this quite funny. And I think in a way this perfectly sums up the kind of the ideological predicament of groups like XR. I think their aim to put things in a more psychoanalytic register is not to subvert the law, but rather to call it forth, to call the law into action, asking it to demonstrate its good side through the creation, in the case of Extinction Rebellion, by setting up citizens' assemblies and what have you. So part of my critique in the book is that what XR is actually kind of looking for is a good master, to put it in Lacanian terms. So in this respect, I think what this kind of eco-moralism, as I call it, fails to realize is that capitalism is in fact completely indifferent to the moral demand, right? In exactly the same way that it's completely indifferent to acts of spectacular or hysterical acting out. And I think, if we want serious change, we have to think certainly beyond capitalism and not ask it to be nice and benevolent, which it's, of course, incapable of being. And I think, in a sense, all of this sounds kind of quite simple and like it should be very, very clear now. But I have a sense that it really isn't, certainly in some respects. I mean, one still reads a lot of the material on degrowth, for example, and one finds language like we need to put the brakes on capitalism, or shed our postures of cynical indifference and demonstrate the power of the 99%. And so in a way, a lot of this kind of hasn't really moved on from the rhetoric of Occupy. And I think that we absolutely need to do that, and we need to take that seriously. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Super. Okay. I mean, one of the things I guess I wanted to come back to is this question of pleasure. I mean, you mentioned that the anti-natalists often seem to take some sort of pleasure in assuming their worldview. Here at the Philosopher, we do run reading groups and classes, and as you know, we ran a reading group on your book earlier this year, and we really enjoyed reading and discussing the book. We took a lot of pleasure out of it. And, there are multiple reasons why that might be the case. It could be the book's aesthetic qualities, or the introduction it provides to a wide range of thinkers, or the interesting associations that are made between popular culture and philosophy, and all sorts of things like that. I mean, there's also, of course, something very pleasurable, though there can be something very pleasurable and valuable about people coming together and talking about these kind of big ideas. But there is something else, though, quite specific, I think, which is that there can be something thrilling and perhaps thrillingly terrifying about thinking and talking about extinction and the end times. And in the book, you do present quite a complex picture of pleasure and its role in relation to thoughts of extinction. I mean, could you say a little bit more about that and this specific idea that you put forward about apocalyptic jouissance?
Yeah. So if I remember correctly, I introduced the notion of apocalyptic jouissance at the end of a reading of Darren Aronofsky's film Mother. Mm-hmm. And I introduce it specifically to describe how the prospect of the end is not only a source of anxiety, but also a source of enjoyment. And therefore, how the end is something that the subject might indeed wish for in this kind of strange sense. But I think this connection between the end, or indeed the prospect of the end, and enjoyment, the connection between the two, plays out on a number of different levels in the book. Mm-hmm. And it's something that I diagnose at different times and in different ways. And maybe there's three ways to think about that. I mean, the first is that there is a kind of basic connection, I think, between anxiety, or specifically anxiety provoked by the prospect of the end, and arousal. I think this is wonderfully demonstrated in a scene in Lars von Trier's great film Melancholia that I discuss in the final chapter of the book, where the character Justine, played by Kirsten Dunst, walks out of the house, one evening and reclines on a riverbank with her naked body kind of bathed in light from the planet Melancholia as it hurtles towards the earth. So the very object that will kind of destroy the earth becomes the object cause of Justine's desire. And we might also think in this context about, why there are so many sex scenes in horror movies, for example. And I think very crudely put, the very thing that causes anxiety and threatens to destroy us also has the power to turn us on. I think, secondly, there is also a kind of pleasure of thinking about extinction in the sense that it seems to kind of satisfy our desire for a certain type of narrative totality. And I think this is precisely what Kant is getting at in his great essay, The End of All Things, that I actually start the book with a discussion of. And he says in that essay that the idea of a final end is what gives worth to the world of rational beings. Without it, as he puts it, I think something along the lines of, creation appears purposeless, like a play having no resolution and seeming to have kind of no rational aim at all. And so to put this kind of same point, I guess, in more contemporary terms, we might say that the capitalist world system is now kind of so vast and chaotic that it's almost impossible to psychically map. So a real ending or a final ending or some sense of a final ending would at least give it some semblance of order. The third thing, or the third way that we might kind of figure this relationship between kind of the end and enjoyment, would be to kind of take it, I think, in this kind of Blockian or kind of Jamesonian way, where the idea of the end of the world is enjoyed or kind of found thrilling precisely because it contains its utopian opposite. So the possibility of a more livable collectivity after the end of capitalism is kind of contained precisely in this idea of the end. I think this is a point that Jameson actually makes in a footnote in the great book on utopia that he has. But I think that, that there's also a potentially kind of darker contemporary side to it as well. I mean, this was something that came to me recently, certainly after finishing the book. So as I was kind of watching the footage of the race riots in the UK earlier on this summer, I was struck then by this sense of how we might kind of think apocalyptic jouissance as an apt term to describe a certain kind of reactionary acting out linked to social decline, political paralysis, class humiliation, the bubbling over of certain negative affects, and a real sense of no future and having nothing left to lose. And so it's a term that can potentially, I think, do a lot of work. And it's one that I've already kind of picked up on in this new book on violence. So, yeah.
I read another interview that you gave where you said that you consider the book to be politically hopeful. And I mean, two of the themes I think I found most interesting in the book related, firstly, to the nature of hope, and secondly, to the possibility of imagining alternative futures. And I'd like to ask you about both of those things in turn, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So one of the key questions you pose in the book, and this is a direct quote, you say, how might we imagine a future that is not simply an extension of the blighted present? you've just mentioned Jameson, and many will be familiar with the idea that's attributed to Jameson that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And one of the ways that you analyze this problem of, imagining alternative futures is through your discussion of extinction and temporality. And you talk quite richly and vividly, I think, about a contemporary sense of stuckness, of being trapped in an undying present and an endless end. So I guess the question is, I mean, how do we become unstuck? How do we collectively begin to imagine the future anew?
Yeah, I mean, I think I described the book at one point in a recent interview as a metaphysics of stuckness, or attempting to put forward a kind of metaphysics of stuckness. And I think, as you very nicely put it there, this whole thing of kind of becoming unstuck is key to the book as a whole, and kind of relates to the subtitle and this whole idea of kind of beginning again at the end. Maybe the first thing to say is that, and I think, quite interestingly, that this condition of stuckness would seem to get theoretically kind of repurposed in a concept like the Anthropocene. So what does the new geological epoch in which the anthropos has become the dominant force? But precisely because the Anthropocene is a new geological epoch, then any real historical agency on the part of human beings has now been foreclosed. So we find ourselves in a situation where kind of mastery and impossibility coincide, where the past is extinguished and the future kind of closed off. So maybe the first step to becoming unstuck is in fact a linguistic one that involves naming the era correctly. So the capital O scene rather than the Anthropocene, for example, or simply naming the enemy correctly, which is late capitalism as such. I think either way, the idea of the Anthropocene is something that's going to have to go. Second, as I argue throughout the book, I mean, this is an idea that's kind of announced in the preface and carries all the way through. I think we need, at a minimum, something like a Benjaminian dialectical sense of temporality. So one that conceives of our collective movement into the future, not as a leap into some great unknown, but rather a process that involves the repetition and completion of the unfinished past. And in this respect, I think we free ourselves from problematic ideas of progress by aiming to actualize alternative potentialities that already lie unrealized in history. And then thirdly, I think, as paradoxical as it might sound, in order to become unstuck will require a mobilization of the death drive, as I argue. And the death drive, as I read it, is not some mysterious force aimed at death and destruction, but precisely the opposite. Despite its name, I read it as situated on the side of life itself. It's ultimately a generative and creative force. And indeed, as Lacan says in his Seminar 7 on the ethics of psychoanalysis, the death drive is the will to create from zero, the will to begin again and to make a fresh start. So our aim, therefore, as I argue, specifically towards the end of the book, should be a kind of creative mobilization, I think, of the death drive, a mobilization of the death drive against ecocide, against war, and against genocide, seeking ultimately to arrive at this point where we can, to paraphrase Freud, die in our own fashion, rather than at the hands of some kind of alien and demonic system.
I mean, there's lots of things that I'd really like to pick up on in that answer. I am conscious of time. I mean, one of the things, I guess, this subtitle of the book, beginning again at the end, you know, and one of the ideas that you express is that any kind of possible emergence of alternative futures, it's going to become possible in the ruins of the current order of things. And you talk about this in a multi-dimensional way. I mean, you've already mentioned a possible transformation in the way that we use language. You also talk about the role of critique in sort of clearing the ground for new forms of life. You talk about the idea of the elimination of the self, lots and lots of things. I guess what I'm not clear on is your view on the role of political violence. And I'm aware that you've said that the next volume in this series is going to look at that more closely. So I'd be interested to know your thoughts on that at this stage of your work.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just to try and keep things as close to the Extinction Project, perhaps at this time as possible. I think we need to begin by being, absolutely clear that in addition to climate and ecological devastation, we've now, I think, quite clearly entered a new period of war without end. This is something that a period that Michael Hart, the philosopher, has recently referred to as a new global war regime in which war is increasingly emerging as a new system of governance. And I think in this context, what the theorist Robert Meester once referred to as the discourse of human rights, rolled out in the kind of the post-Cold War era as a new standard of human civilization. I think if the West's claim to have renounced violence didn't already end in the dungeons of Abu Ghraib, then it certainly has done on the killing fields of Gaza. And I think, in this sense, then progressive, it might kind of attempt to present itself. That, we will need to kind of develop a new international strategy in order to remake the world. And I think this is precisely what Walter Benjamin is grappling with, or something indeed very, very similar in his own time. And it's to these elements of his thinking that I return in the final chapter of the book, where the whole issue of violence is kind of raised most explicitly. So Benjamin talks there about what he calls a new positive barbarism, which might allow us, he says, to make a fresh start. So almost kind of echoing what Lacan has to say about the death drive. And then in relation to this, positive barbarism, we also, hear from Benjamin about what he calls the destructive character, about which he says, the destructive character knows only one watchword, make room, and only one activity, clearing away. What exists is reduced to rubble, not for the sake of the rubble, but for the way leading through it. And it seems to me that Benjamin's point here is pretty clear, that the new can come about only through a fully accomplished destruction. Against capitalist destruction, what is required is a rejuvenating destruction of capitalism itself. But this is not to advocate any kind of radical political violence necessarily. I think for Benjamin, the real bloodlust is always on the side of the state. So I think very interestingly in Benjamin's earlier essay from 1921, The Critique of Violence, where he famously distinguishes between what he calls mythic violence, which is legal violence, the violence of the state, and divine violence, which for him is the cause mythic violence, and he's on the side of life. The one concrete example that Benjamin actually provides of divine violence is actually the proletarian general strike, which aims at the dissolution of the existing state apparatus. And so while the state would no doubt see this as a violent action, Benjamin is extremely clear that it's not violent at all. And indeed, he takes very seriously the proposition, thou shalt not kill, specifically in that essay. I mean, I think that we have to be very clear, that there is no possible world completely beyond violence and conflict, precisely because I think there is, as Freud and Lacan teach us very well, there is no possible world completely beyond human antagonism. But there is, I think, absolutely a possible world beyond genocide, and indeed a possible world in which the mass of human beings no longer live in the permanent shadow of nuclear annihilation. It may, however, require a certain kind of violent anti-violence in order to get us there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's helpful clarification. I'm aware of the time, and I know that some questions have come in. So I wonder if I could just ask one more question of you before I then go to the audience questions. And it's back to this question of hope. And I just wondered if you could talk more about the sort of the specific form that you think this hope will take. I mean, in the book, you argue, following Kierkegaard and Adorno, that hope can only be arrived at by way of despair, that this despair expresses a desire that things should be otherwise, that can function as a revolutionary affect. I mean, I think this is true, and I agree with you that radical politics needs to fully confront the nature of our contemporary moment and not offer false promises or false hope. I guess my question is, how do we sustain ourselves through this despair, both individually and collectively, particularly when, as we've discussed, this sort of possibility of imagining alternative futures is often blocked to us? How do we keep going?
It's a great question. How do we keep going, indeed? I think, look, I mean, in one sense, we sustain ourselves in the old ways, right? We sustain ourselves through solidarity. We sustain ourselves through comradeship, recognition of what it is we're actually up against, but also an awareness of the fact that new openings will always emerge. I think, intellectually speaking, we will need to mount a robust defense of dialectical thinking, a robust defense of Marxism, which, to paraphrase Jameson, remains the untranscendable horizon of all political, social, and economic thought. I specify here Marxism rather than anarchism or left-wing social democracy, because it seems sometimes today that people have forgotten that there is an actual difference between these things. And finally, I think, while I would, and clearly do, absolutely defend psychoanalysis and specifically Freudian Lacanian psychoanalysis, both as a set of theoretical ideas and as a clinical practice, I would also say, as a kind of warning, that in our current time of catastrophe, when lots of people are turning to therapy, we need to be extremely cautious about the individualizing aspects of therapeutic discourse. So yes, we come to analysis one by one, each with our own kind of individual symptom, but we do suffer, I think, in remarkably similar ways, and all at the hands of the same system. And so I think the proposition, I suffer, therefore I am, might be kind of, better thought of as something like, we suffer, therefore we must negate. And will completely disagree with me here, but I think analysis, therapy, whatever one wants to call it, has to be a way back in our current moment to a new kind of collective politics. And then, once and if we arrive at a more livable future, then more analysis for sure. Yeah.
Super, thank you. Okay, so we've got 10 minutes left. So I'm going to turn to some questions from the audience. So the first one is, do you consider any film that's best captured the themes of your book and the prospect of human extinction, apart from the wonderful Melancholia, or any music, in fact?
Yeah, my first thought would be Melancholia, which is absolutely the hinge film in the entire book. And deals with, there's so much there, and I think one of the issues that we didn't come to in the question specifically, I mean, this whole idea of a politics of subjective destitution, and the individual subject needing to kind of lose its symbolic coordinates in order to kind of find them again, somewhere else. And I think Justine is a kind of wonderful example of that. Other films,
And a fantastic use of Wagner in that film as well.
Yes, indeed, absolutely, yeah. And that, yeah, the other film that I mentioned briefly is the Aronofsky film, of course, Mother.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, I think, to think of the climate emergency, and how not to kind of respond to it. I think it gives us a sense of this idea, going back to the anti-natalists in a way, Mother Nature in need of kind of care and protection, and I think it takes us in all these kind of problematic and kind of reactionary directions, but a very, very interesting film nevertheless. Yeah. Are there others? Yeah, for sure. I'm sure they'll come back to me as the questions go on. So if I can add anything else before the end, I will do.
Thank you. Okay, next question is, does your work deal with Kant's writing on progress and the possibility of failure? Could you say something about the very idea of progress from your own perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't, I mean, it's certainly not in this book. There is no explicit engagement with Kantian notions of progress. I mean, the thing that immediately comes to mind in terms of that idea of progress is the title of one of Adorno's late essays that appears in the collection Critical Models, I think, which is called Progress, that Adorno says something like, it's only in the face of extinction, or only in the face of the prospect of extinction, does our collective humanity actually emerge in the first place. And I bring this essay, you know, that particular kind of line in the essay, but also the essay as a whole, into dialogue in the first chapter of the book with, you know, a very kind of provocative essay by Blanchot called "The Apocalypse is Disappointing." And Blanchot, I think, is saying something remarkably kind of similar to Adorno there, that, you know, it's only in the face of the possibility or the prospect of nuclear catastrophe that we get a sense of the whole, of totality, and what it would mean for the you know, the whole to be extinguished or, you know, rendered extinct. And therefore, you know, but then he makes this nice move saying, but the whole doesn't not yet exist. So in the face of extinction, it's precisely this whole that we now need to create. And I think that's a lovely move, which, so, you know, we get back then to this whole, you know, Hegelian idea about what politically we can get out of this. So yeah, that's my association to progress there. Yeah.
Super, thank you. Okay, next question. So Nietzsche had said the gay science, where are we headed? Are we not endlessly plunging backwards, sideways, forwards, in all directions? This is from The Death of God. He went on to write against the trouble of nihilism. In one regard, do you consider On Extinction to also be a response against a troubled present and future where we search for meaning endlessly?
Short answer, yes. Yeah, I mean, Nietzsche is not a figure that plays a substantial role in my work as a whole, or indeed this book. But what I would say is that at the beginning of chapter 1, just after I engage with the essay by Kant, The End of Things, I turn to Nietzsche's essay. I think, you know, very interestingly, has this kind of thought experiment about the extinction of all things, the end of the world. And you know, the point that Nietzsche is trying to make, I think, by kind of rolling that out, is that if we kind of see things from this perspective, that, you know, one day, you know, humanity will no longer exist, then we get this sense of how, I think he puts it, how, you know, how small and insignificant the human race actually kind of is in the first place. And I think, you know, this is, again, you know, Nietzsche making a kind of quite, you know, reactionary point. And then Nietzsche's work can often and has been used in certain, you know, ecological contexts for seemingly kind of quite, you know, productive and fruitful kind of ends. But essentially, I think it kind of leads in, as I argue at the end of the first section in chapter 1, to a kind of eco-fascism.